Okay, it is 7:24 now on this beautiful Tuesday evening here in the Rocky Mountains. I think it's Tuesday. I'm Ross Kaminsky, morning host here on 630 KHOW for those of you joining us through the dial-in lines. And again, our conversation, our second Ready Colorado gubernatorial town hall, our conversation this evening is with successful businessman and former state legislator Victor Mitchell. His website, vic4gov.com, VIC, the number 4, GOV.com. And actually, Victor, I would like to ask you, before we get to the higher ed stuff, just very briefly, tell us about your experience as a state legislator and why you decided not to run again. It wasn't that you lost. You decided not to run again.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, thank you. I mean, it was a great experience. I loved it. Actually, most of my colleagues are currently supporting me for my run for governor. The answer is you can serve the public in government or out of government. I've always been that way. I mean, I served one term, I loved the term, and I went back into the private sector. The question is really, what have I done since I've been in the private sector? I've taught at 2 state universities. I've with my wife and I, we raised 3 amazing kids, and I've also built one of the most successful private companies today in Colorado. I also led a statewide effort in 2011 to defeat what would have been the largest tax increase in Colorado history. So I've been very, very active, but I'm just not a career politician. I'm an outsider. I'm a businessman. I'm a reformer. And I guess that's why the party establishment doesn't like me so much.
I want to bring on a caller who wants to, I think, follow up a little bit on something we talked about before. Let's go to Ann. Hey, Ann, you are on with Ross Kaminsky and with gubernatorial candidate Victor Mitchell. What's your question for Victor?
Programs of science, math, technical, and so forth, being the most important studies we have in our schools right now. I beg to differ with that. I think we need to have social studies, English, math, as well as math. And we need to have well-rounded students rather than just people who are technologically advanced. And also, as part of that, students who can understand things such as the Constitution to make better citizens.
Thank you very much, Ann. So, Victor, what's your take on Ann's question? I think she's asking whether you are too focused on STEM and discounting some of the other things that she thinks are important.
It's a fair question. It's absolutely a fair question. No one is talking about doing away with social studies or English. We have to do, and you're absolutely right, Ann, that we need to do a lot more on civics. But the modern economy that we have today, we have such a shortage of kids, most especially girls, who are taking on these really tough technical degrees. To put it in some perspective, if you can take an at-risk kid, a kid that's on subsidized lunch, you take him through high school, you get him to college, you remediate him, hopefully, if he needs remediation, get him through college where they actually have a degree, they graduate with it, become an electrical engineer or a physicist. You take a kid immediately into the middle class. These jobs start at $80,000 a year, $100,000 a year, $120,000. They change people's lives. There's nothing more we could do for income inequality than getting kids relevant degrees. It also gives these kids a foundation of skills, of problem solving, that they can pursue whatever career path they want to go in. So we've got to start thinking about these technical fields. I can tell you that places around the world are taking this very seriously, and I'm very worried about it. We have a very diverse economy here in Colorado. We have a very technical economy in Colorado, and we just have a shortage of these kids taking on these much tougher disciplines. We really want to encourage them as much as we can in our public schools.
To ask a question of Victor Mitchell, *3 on your phones. The results on the first poll, 70% of you said yes, the state should start reporting school performance ratings in an easier-to-understand format like A through F or 1 through 5 stars. Only 6% said no. The rest said not sure. Let me quickly give you the second poll question before we move on to the higher ed conversation with Victor Mitchell. Do you believe that local school boards should have a monopoly on opening public charter schools? Press 1 for yes, 2 for no, and 3 for not sure. Once again, do you think local school boards should have a monopoly on opening public charter schools? 1 for yes, 2 for no, 3 for not sure. Higher education, Victor, I've been reading some of your positions and reading other things that you've said, and you're quite consistent when you go from K through 12 to the higher ed stuff in terms of STEM and the value of that kind of thing in the economy. And one of the things that you talked about was how in some higher education settings these days, the degrees that we really want to encourage people to get cost more to get than the degrees that you, at least, would rather not have as many people focus on. Can you talk about that a little bit?
So my plan for higher ed is I want to triple the amount of STEM graduates in Colorado. There's roughly 1 in 4 in our Colorado universities are graduating these STEM degrees. Actually, the latest acronym is STEAM, because there's an artistic component as well. My plan is to take all the money we currently use out of our general fund and earmark it entirely for STEM disciplines. So if you want to study petroleum engineering at Mines, or you want to study electrical engineering at CU, those degrees would actually become the least expensive degrees. Right now, they're the most expensive degrees. And degrees like liberal arts studies would become slightly more expensive. But my plan also in higher ed, unlike what we've had over the last years, I want a complete freeze on tuition rates during my entire term of my administration for higher ed. And I also want to drive down the high cost of and make it much more affordable student housing. Student housing is about a third of the cost to go to college. We're now the fourth most expensive state in the country to send a kid to college here in Colorado, an in-state kid. We have to do a lot more. It hasn't been a focus at all. They obviously don't have a great amount of advocacy, but it's just we're not getting our kids through in the right degrees. It's taking too long to get them through. And then and student housing, I mean, at CU alone, they're charging our kids $13,000 a year. It's a complete rip.
So I always want to be very careful when folks talk about how I'm going to freeze prices and I'm going to lower costs and I'm going to do all this stuff. And I know you're a finance guy. I mean, your current very successful business is a financial business. So I don't think you live in the world of, fairy dust and unicorn farts, sure. Financing projects. So how can you keep costs flat, put a freeze on tuitions, lower housing costs, lower the cost of getting STEM degrees, and say that it's not going to cost the taxpayer money? Are you taking it from other parts of government? What is it?
Not at all. So first of all, I mean, I don't want to conflate what you just said, but let's focus on student housing. We're an incredibly real estate-centric economy in Colorado. We have many graduates from CSU, from CU, from just about every state university in Colorado that are today working in real estate. There's many alumni they can call on, many developers that we can call on, and most of our universities have sufficient land to build student housing. Today at CU, they're really only providing student housing to freshmen, even though they have 40,000 students, many graduate programs, postgraduate degrees. We have to be much smarter about this. It shouldn't cost $13,000 a year for a student, for a shared room, a Wi-Fi card, and a meal plan. That's just not good enough. It should be $3,000 or $4,000 a year. So there's real opportunity to drive that cost down in student housing. That's a significant chunk of it. As far as the revenue, is revenue neutral is my proposal. So we're actually degrees like liberal studies and liberal arts degrees are going to cost slightly more. Electrical engineering's technical degrees are going to cost significantly less, so that's going to be revenue neutral. But as far as we're not going to be doing this with mandates. I mean, if the Colorado does subsidize a great deal of our state universities, we should have a say in how that money's allocated. We have too many associate deans at our state universities. We have too many, adjunct professors like myself that have a lot of business experience and professional background, but our tenured professors are not teaching. I mean, we've got some work to do.
You are listening to the second Ready Colorado gubernatorial town hall. My special guest, businessman Victor Mitchell, and I think we're going to move on from education now. We spent about half our time on education. I want to move on to some other things, and I actually think I'm going to start our first non-education topic by bringing a caller on to the line. Kathy, good evening. You're on with Ross Kaminsky and, more importantly, with Victor Mitchell. What is your question for Victor Mitchell?
Is it me?
It is you.
Nice to meet you.
Okay. Para, I was in the education system. It's terrible. And
so
anyway,
what's the question?
Okay. Para is underfunded. It's going to go broke.
So I guess, I just in the interest of time, I just really want to get to the question. I guess your question, Kathy, is what does Victor Mitchell plan to do with Para, right?
Okay.
Very good. I appreciate that. Thank you for getting the conversation going.
Well, nice to talk with you. So my plan for Para is pretty straightforward. Right now, if you serve in state government in any capacity for 20 years, you take your last 3 years average, and that average determines the 75% payout for life. That's just simply just too generous, too expensive. So I want to change that from a 3-year average to a 10-year average. But we have too many perverse incentives when it comes to para. For example, if you join state government, you have to participate in para. That's wrong. Well, I'd like to eliminate as much as 20% of our state workforce. And I don't want those people to participate in para because it's only going to be temporary positions. I'm looking for young people that are coming out of college where they could work, do a lot of volunteerism, do a lot of community outreach, learn and basically want to serve their state government, but after a couple of years go back into the private sector. And in return, they would get a low wage, but they'd also get $30,000 of student debt relief. So there is absolutely reforms. Now, to put it in some perspective, para today has about a $40 billion fund, and they're paying out about $2.5 billion a year. So for them to go broke, it would have to be basically they get zero returns on their current $40 billion, and they'd have about 16 years to pay that out. There's no question para needs some significant reforms, and it is today, under the way the current system works, a massive unfunded liability. But all this could be corrected statutorily with changing the incentives. So people, when they leave state government, it's not going to create a deficiency in the fund. But we also have to be much smarter about the benefits, especially for new people entering into para.
Well, what does that mean, change the incentives? I mean, it sounded like you were talking about changing retirement benefits to some. I can't tell what that means. Can you be more specific?
Absolutely. So we're not going to change retirement benefits for people that have already qualified. Sure. We made a promise. We're going to stick with that promise. We're talking about new people entering into the system that want to work in state government. We've got to be much smarter about this. The government is just too big, too intrusive. Government doesn't create any wealth for anybody. The wealth is really created in our economy through the private sector. So we have to be much smarter that we're not creating incentives where young people enter into state government but never want to leave because the benefits are so rich. Right now, that's the way the system currently works. So no, we're not talking about stripping away benefits for retirees. The other thing, too, that's important for people to understand is when it comes to para, it's easy to bash para. I know a lot of my opponents are bashing para quite a bit. But para, if you receive para, you do not receive Social Security. So it's your lifeblood for retirement. And if we made a promise, we should keep the promise. But of all the serious challenges we have, you've talked about roads and infrastructure, you're talking about, we've had 120,000 pages of rules and regulations crushing small business and entrepreneurship formation. Those, to me, are much more serious and much more pressing today. I think that para is not a crisis the way some people have led it to be. It's a serious issue. It can be resolved, and it can be resolved statutorily.
Would you support changing para to a defined contribution program instead of a defined benefit program for new enrollees?
Of course, defined contribution plans are generally the way it's done in the private sector.
Yeah.
Defined benefit plans, I mean, if you look at some of the history of defined benefit plans, just about every private employer that's ever had a defined benefit plan has gone bankrupt. I mean, all you have to do is look at the airlines across this country and many other institutions that have had that. So defined benefit plans generally have been proven to be quite unsustainable over the long run. That should be on the table. But I don't think that's as critical of an issue as fixing the 3-year average to a 10-year average and creating incentives where people can come into state government to serve and then leave state government and go back into the private sector. It was never our intentions as a country to create people that would work in government forever. Then government would guarantee them jobs. I think that's just a bad outcome for Colorado. We're just too industrious. We're too rugged of a people to be so reliant upon government jobs.
My fear with it is that if we don't take the threat of para to our state budget seriously enough and let it go too long, that we'll end up like Illinois, or, maybe not that bad, but in a situation that we don't want to be in. That's really, really what frightens me about it.
You can be rest assured, and my administration will deal with it. We'll fix it. I mean, I'm not indebted to any special interest groups. I'm a true outsider, and the biggest reason I'm running is my love of the state and tired of we have too many politicians and not enough leaders. So I will get it resolved. I will work. I've built great coalitions. I've had great working relationships with legislators, and not only conservatives like myself, but people that are of different party affiliations, and we've actually gotten things done. So I know how to work with people. I know how to get things done. I understand the legislative process. This can be fixed. It can be fixed legislatively. It can be done without creating a crisis for the existing retirees that are receiving the benefits. But there's no question there are structural reforms that need to happen.
All right, let me move on. Let me ask you one more question before a break, and then when we come back from the break, what we're gonna aim to do is a lightning round. We're gonna get a lot of callers, and we're going to get, quick questions, quick answers, and try to get a lot of stuff in. Before we do that, I have a question that I want to ask you about. Obviously, in this last legislative session, you must have paid very close attention, as we all did. Infrastructure was a huge issue.
Yes.
How to fix our roads and then how to pay for our roads. What are Victor Mitchell's plans? What would you imagine being your first year of Victor Mitchell as governor dealing with infrastructure in Colorado and how to pay for it?
So I've pledged to pour $2 billion in year one directly into contractors' hands, year one, without increasing taxes or fees. So how am I going to do that? Well, first and foremost, we're going to bring in a reformer to run CDOT. Our current executive director is a bureaucrat. He's never really had any private sector experience. We're going to bring in an executive, somebody with a deep amount of development and relevant industry experience to reform CDOT, the bidding process and what have you. CDOT today, only about a third of their $1.5 billion annual budget actually goes into roads, about $400 to $500 million a year. We're going to change that to a maximum of 20% of their entire operating budget can go to overhead. That means that basically there's another $700 million a year that can go into roads. They have another $1 billion that's of cash and cash equivalents that's today that's on their balance sheet that could also be deployed immediately into contractors' hands to fix our infrastructure. We have to use a lot more modern technologies like traffic sciences, something called algorithmic traffic flows to create incentives for people to use at the optimum times. But I also want to change the Legislative Audit Committee as well, which is a financial auditing committee. It's one of the few committees in our entire General Assembly that have equal members of House members and senators of Republicans and Democrats. I want to change that from financial to performance auditing. So meaning that they're going to look at all the different state bureaucracies and they're going to take all the partisan politics out of it and come back and say, you know what, CDOT can be right-sized with 2,000 employees instead of 3,300 employees. And if we can save 3 to 4% by just changing that one committee, that's another $1 billion that could go into infrastructure and other critical needs of the state.
If you have a question for Victor Mitchell, *3 on your phones. And if you want to ask Victor a question the old-fashioned radio way, my number here in the studio is 303-713-TALK. See if you can give me a fairly quick answer to this, Victor, so then we can come back with the lightning round. Is there any circumstance under which you would support a tax increase to fund infrastructure? And if so, what kind of tax increase would be palatable to you?
No tax increases, no user fees. We have a $28.6 billion budget. It's up about $10 billion in the last decade. We've had a 23% increase in population, 40% increase in size of government. We do not have a revenue issue. We have a spending issue, and we have to do more with less.
You are listening to the second Ready Colorado gubernatorial candidate town hall with businessman Victor Mitchell. When we come back, we're going to do a lightning round. We're going to ask fast questions. We're going to bring as many of you on as we can in the time we have left, and Victor promises fast answers so we can get as many of you on as possible. We'll be right back. You're listening to the Ready Colorado gubernatorial town hall.